Thank you very much. Great to be here. Good morning. So for those of you who don't know the Reuters Institute, excuse me, we're part of Oxford University. So we're actually a separate organisation from the news agency, though we have a very close relationship with them. We run a journalist fellowship programme, and we conduct a range of research into the news industry that I'm going to draw on today as we discuss these critical issues of trust, fragmentation of attention, and of course the potential impact of AI. And I'm going to refer to data from our annual digital news report, which is based on representative surveys of 2,000 people in more than 40 countries. I'll also draw on insights from our annual trends report, and I'll spend a bit of time talking about our recent work looking at the impact of generative AI. So just starting with some overall trends from our annual surveys. So this is a reminder of what's been going on in the UK over the last few years. So this is a weekly reach across popular news sources. And the big story here is really the decline of traditional sources. This won't surprise you. Decline of print in the red. Over time, 59% read a printed newspaper in 2013. That's down to 14%. And then you also see the decline of television. And these are having really sort of significant impacts on changing habits. Online news, broadly flat. So it's not really making up the gap, essentially. We've seen that rise in social media that Jules referred to 2016. That's really leveled off in terms of news use. Part of the reason for this gap and online not making up the gap is we also see rising disconnection. So this is a line which shows the percentage of people who say they don't consume any of these sources, including radio. It's not on the chart. And you can see that going from 1% to 10%. Many of these people perhaps used to read tabloid newspapers. They tend to be younger, lower educational backgrounds. At the same time, this is a scary chart. This is at the same time we see the decline in the proportion of people in the UK that say they are very or extremely interested in the news. And it's hard to know what's going on here. It's partly related to depressing news agenda. You can see how it's dipped since COVID, particularly. So COVID probably had an impact as well. Wars in the Middle East, Ukraine. Maybe changing definitions of news. It's just that people are less interested in sort of narrow news, more interested in a broad range of things that are now available on the internet. But this is a worrying chart in its own right. And then another data point that we've talked about for some time is this concept of selective news avoidance. So people who consume the news regularly, but they also say that they often or sometimes avoid it, perhaps at particular times of day, perhaps they avoid particular subjects. And as you can see in the UK, that's now 46%, and that's the highest level that we've seen since we started tracking this in 2017. And many of the sort of open comments refer to the negativity of the news agenda, the difficult nature of the news agenda, also the sense of powerlessness that people feel there's nothing they can do in the face of these huge global issues like climate change or wars in the Middle East. But it's not only loss of attention, it's also loss of connection, as Jules was saying, between news brands and audiences, particularly younger audiences. So this is a question we ask about what's your main way of getting to the news? Where do you prefer to start your news journey? And you can see for younger people in the UK, social media in the blue, now the most important route, and then directly going to a website or app, something of an afterthought, so just 14%. Whereas for over 35s, this really shows the very strong news brands and those connections that older people still have with news brands. So this really different generational split in terms of preferences. Search and social for older people play a smaller role. So when we think about AI and the increased role of platforms with younger generations, it's likely to be more challenging going forward. We can also look at that data over time, and this is just looking at direct preferences here by age, and the blue line is over 35s, and you can see actually we haven't seen a huge amount of change. Older people like me still like to go to traditional news sites online. But if we look at 18 to 24s, you can see this this group of social natives coming into our sample from about 2018. And you can really see that change because they've grown up with the social internet, much less likely to go directly, much more likely to focus on social media. That's kind of where we've been. But when we think about what's happening today, and when we think about young people, we're also really seeing a significant change in the type of social networks and platforms that young people are using. Best way of looking at this is looking at, over time, the percentage of people who say they use Facebook, for example, for news. This is aggregated data across 12 countries. And you can see here that decline is partly because Facebook themselves have reduced the amount of news that they show in the feeds. And you can also see where things are changing. You can see the growth here in video networks or youth-based networks, so YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. At the same time, as we see this change in the types of networks, we see changes in the formats. So even Facebook and Twitter are trying to keep people within the networks using native video and other interactive formats. So this sort of post and refer model that we've been used to is not completely dead, but it's definitely breaking down, even before you get to the potential impact on search through artificial intelligence and new interfaces. And then when we look at these newer networks like TikTok, and when we look at new storytelling formats, we find that traditional media actually finds it really hard to compete with some of these emerging news influencers and news creators. And this is just an example from Gaza, for example. You have a creator in a bedroom, such as News Daddy, who has around 10 million followers on TikTok, getting more attention, even on subjects like Gaza, than the New York Times on the right, with this fantastic piece of vertical video, but it's not connecting because it doesn't feel as authentic, or it doesn't come from people who look like us. So this is another challenge in terms of the switch and the change that we're seeing in the social media landscape. And all of this, of course, brings us on to the issues of trust and misinformation, subject of today's discussion. So firstly, in terms of measuring trust, this is just a chart around a data point around general levels of trust. So we ask about to what extent you trust most news most of the time. So it's a very sort of top-level data point. But you can see that in most of the big countries across the world, and in Europe, including the UK, those trust levels are on a downward trend. So before the Brexit referendum, over half of our samples said that they trusted most news. That's down to just 36% today. And I don't think that's because of the quality of journalism, that it's got worse. It's rather that in these very divided societies, people see things that they don't like increasingly in the media because of polarized debates about politics, about culture, and quite often they blame the messenger. But you can see very clearly the impact of these external events. So Brexit, you can also see in these charts how COVID increased trust during the crisis because people were really searching for reliable information. It's important to say this is not the case everywhere. So there are some North European markets where trust has not declined and where, in fact, trust has gone up even since COVID. I'm just showing you the Netherlands there. There are lots of other reasons, of course, for low trust, including increasing levels of criticism of journalists and of media companies. So this chart plots media criticism that people say they see on the y-axis, and then low levels of trust going to the right on the x-axis. And when we ask about the sources of that criticism, we find that in many countries it is actually the politicians and political activists at the top that people blame most, followed by ordinary people, celebrities, and even other journalist organizations criticizing other journalist organizations. So this is part of the story as well. And then, of course, that link with misinformation and disinformation, where people's concern across all of the countries that we look at is up by 3 percentage points this year to 59% who say they worry about their ability to tell what's true and what's not true on the internet when it comes to news. You can also see there are bigger levels of concern in the UK, in the US, and in some other countries that have been holding elections this year. So this year in the Digital News Report, we asked people about the most important factors which decide whether you trust or don't trust a news organization. And I guess these results are not particularly surprising, but I think they are clear, they are consistent across countries and across age groups. People expect the news media to have high standards of accuracy, of ethics. They expect the news media to be transparent and open, as far as possible to be unbiased, or at least to be open about any biases, not to exaggerate or sensationalize, and also to be fair in terms of coverage of different groups. So if people basically have low trust, it's because for one reason or another they believe these things are not currently happening. I think one of the really interesting data points for me is this focus on transparency about how the news is made. And many media companies, this is true across all countries, and many media companies really are trying to make more of it. I think we're going to hear more about that later in the session, doubling down on this idea that if we could be more transparent, if we could show our workings better, it would be easier to separate journalism from the rest of information on the internet. And we see this as important. One word of caution that actually when you look at people who are already deeply skeptical, and there are quite a lot of those, then transparency, openness is often seen as a criticism of them. So it's not going to work for all audiences. There's no sort of silver bullet or one way of dealing with this. And then, of course, we have to factor in the impact of artificial intelligence on all of this, which is really just still starting in terms of the impact. In terms of what that's going to do to trust, what it's going to do to misinformation. And as I say, we're still at very early stages. So in the survey this year, we asked about two scenarios. So firstly, how comfortable people were with content that was produced mainly by the AI, but maybe with some human oversight. So examples might be an AI bot, or maybe a story that is written by AI and then checked by a human. And in general, what we see here is very high levels of discomfort. So that's the red, both in the US and the UK, a bit more comfortable in the US, perhaps because of higher awareness, perhaps because some of the companies involved are American companies. And then there's the second scenario where journalists remain in control, and the AI is doing supporting tasks. So that might be helping with verification of misinformation, for example. It might be research, transcription, a whole range of different things. And in all cases here, we see people more comfortable than uncomfortable. So this very strong message that people really want to have humans and journalists in control, in the loop. So there's lots of examples now around the industry of how Gen AI is being used in audience, increasing numbers of examples of Gen AI being used responsibly and irresponsibly. These are just some examples from Sweden of summarization, one of the most popular, from Aftonbladet, a tabloid newspaper, and they say that putting these AI-driven summaries really drives engagement in early tests. We also have examples, this from a German newspaper, of graphical styles. So taking food, for example, and applying that style through AI to a whole load of recipes and producing images automatically. This is a German tabloid newspaper that's actually writing 5% of its stories now through an AI called Clara Indernack. There's been a lot of controversy about this and about the choice that they've made around the image there. And they have an aim to increase that to around 30% over time. And then you have increasing numbers of AI synthetic content avatars. This is an example from a radio station in Mexico, for example, which has 3 of these synthetic avatars who are creating content around news and entertainment and proving quite successful in Instagram, for example. So these are just some of the ways in which it's being used. Of course, search is being transformed in different ways. If you use Perplexity or Perplexity Pro, you're starting to see a glimpse into the future and how referral or citations might work, for example. Media companies are developing bots, conversational ways of interacting. This is a Swedish example again around the Swedish elections. The FT has developed a way of querying all of its content, which is currently just in trial. So lots of really interesting examples which raise questions around labeling, trust, a whole range of these different issues. And then there's the other really interesting possibility about taking content and transforming it to make it more relevant to deal with some of these issues of avoidance and disconnection. So, for example, taking a text story and turning it into automatically into audio or into a different language. So these are really exciting possibilities of ways of addressing some of the issues that I've talked about. Artifact, taking a story and making it simpler to understand for younger people, for example. So in our research this year, we showed people many of these examples to get a sense of what this might do in terms of trust and people's approaches to it. What we found is a lot of those behind-the-scenes roles people are much more comfortable with. They could see the benefits to news organizations in terms of making them more efficient, but also to themselves in making the content more relevant. Transformation was a bit more mixed, so people really liked the idea of more relevant content, maybe in their own language, something that spoke to them more directly, but they also worried about hyper-personalization and missing out. And then much more concern generally about, at the moment anyway, much more skepticism, concern about content that was created by the AI, even if there is human oversight. And then apart from these different use cases, there's also an important question of the medium. So generally, what we found is people were a little bit more forgiving when it came to AI being used to generate text. They're already used to looking at text and not believing it and reading between the lines, trying to uncover biases. Then there are the stylized illustrations that I showed you earlier, graphical treatments. People broadly are quite comfortable with that. They see it as a continuation of tools like Photoshop. They don't feel on the whole that they're being misled here, which I think is the key point. But people were really much more worried about photorealistic images like this one, much more worried about AI-generated videos, even if they hadn't seen these to a large extent yet, because it's going to be increasingly hard to tell the difference between what is real and what is not. And until now, when you looked at a photo, you looked at a video, for the most part, people felt confident in believing that. And I think going forward, that's not going to be the case, and that's going to be a major change when we think about misinformation and trust. So just to summarize some of the things I've been talking about, so this challenge of attention and engagement. So of course, some of us have never been better informed. We've never had more access to information, but large groups of people are turning away from the news, becoming less interested or actively avoiding it. We have we're in the midst of this real technological change and platform shifts at the beginning of another big change. Platforms are either disinvesting like Facebook, or they are setting up alternatives as yet unproven ways of accessing the news and interacting with the news. So there's going to be a lot of change in the next few years. Video news is on the rise. For many media companies, it's really hard to change, to adapt these formats, and in many cases losing out to influencers, native influencers and creators. Trust is falling, concern about the misinformation is rising, and then the uncertain impact of what's going to happen with AI. It's very early days. The public remains pretty skeptical. It wants humans to remain in the loop, and it definitely doesn't want to be misled. Thanks very much.